We've learned about the 9 main validation methods for checking a model's data. There's actually one more, only this validation doesn't check a model's data, it checks the data of associated models. In other words, it uses the active record associations like has many and belongs to make sure that those objects that are related to an object are valid before it considers the object valid. You only really need to use it when you're going to be creating 2 or more objects in one step and there's a real dependency between the two. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine that a user is going to create an auction for a car. The user fills out the auction details like the minimum bid and the car details like the year and the model and the color, all on one web form. And when they submit that form, we're going to need to save the auction to the auctions table and its has one related car to the cars table. We try to save the auction first, it passes all its validations, and it saves to the database. Next we try to save the car, but the user forgot to put in the color, so it fails its validations and it can't save. What we want is to redisplay the form so the user can add the color and then resubmit it to us. But we've already saved a record for the auction. We'd need to delete that so that we could resave it when they resubmit the form. Instead, it would be better if we could look ahead and check to see if the car is valid or not before we save the auction. In other words, these two objects are so closely related that we shouldn't consider the auction to be valid unless the car is also valid. And that's what validates associated lets us do. Validates associated checks to see if the object or objects in an association are all valid. Like the other validation methods, we can pass in options to the second argument, the options hash. We can have a custom message. We can say whether it should take place on, save, create, or update, and only if or unless certain conditions are met. But there are a couple of differences from the other validations that we've looked at. First and most obviously, it doesn't end in underscore of. The other difference is that the first argument is no longer going to be an attribute symbol. Instead, it'll be the name of the association as a symbol, the same name that we're using for belongs to, has many, and so on. The third difference is that we can only call validates associated on its own. We can't use the validates method that we just saw in the last movie, otherwise known as sexy validations. We can't use that with validates associated. So what is validates associated doing for us? Well, it's actually not that magical. What it's doing is calling valid question mark on the object or on an array of objects to see if those things are valid or not. So the code in that last line roughly approximate what's going on. Add an error unless the associated objects, all of them, are valid. If they all return true as being valid, well then we don't need to add an error. Now because this is the way that it's working and it's iterating through whatever objects are there, there's something we need to watch out for, which is that the validation does not fail if there's not an associated object there at all. It only takes whatever exists and checks to make sure that that is valid. So if we need to make sure that it exists, then we also need to add another validation to validate the presence of the object before we call validates associated. That'll check and make sure that it exists, and then we can check and make sure that it's valid immediately after. Now you don't have to use these two in conjunction with each other, but it's very common that you do them both together, that you validate the presence of an object and then immediately check to see whether that related object is valid as well. There are two other things that you need to watch out for: infinite loops and long cascades. With infinite loops, what you want to make sure of is that you don't have two different models that are related to each other that are both looking at each other to check whether they're validates associated. So in my example, with auction and car, you could have validates associated on the auction, checking to make sure the car is valid, or you could have it the other way around, the car checking that the auction is valid. But you wouldn't want to do it both ways, because then each one would run its validations and say, hey, are you valid? And the other one would run its validations, and partway through it would stop and say, oh, are you valid? And it would go back and forth and create an infinite loop. The second thing to be aware of is long cascades. If we have an object that's checking a collection of objects, there may be 100 different objects. If we're going to ask all of them to check whether they're valid, and then each one of those may have another 30 objects, then we're going to check all of those to see whether they're valid. You end up with this very long cascade. And that's why validates associated works best in very limited cases. Let's use the auction and car example that I gave you at the beginning and actually look at some code for this. There's no place that we're going to need this in our simple CMS, but I want you to actually just see what it looks like. So the auction has one car. It's going to have its own validations. I'm using the validates method on starting bid to check for its presence and its numericality. And then I've got validates presence of the car, followed immediately by validates associated car. The first one is going to make sure that the car is actually there, and the second one is going to then ask, hey car, are you valid? And in the car class, I've got a belongs to auction and a few more validations for the year, the model, and the color. So again, you won't use validates associated that often, and you could write code yourself that would do this same kind of checking for you. Validates associated just gives you an automatic way to make sure that 2 or more models all are valid before you start saving to the database.